Hi, I'm Barrett. I'm from period 3.
I'm Evelyn from period 3.
And I'm Fletcher from period 4. And we're doing our discussion on Lincoln
From 2012.
The movie directed
Yes.
by Steven Spielberg. So, in what ways does Spielberg's portrayal of Abraham Lincoln align with or challenge the traditional narrative of him as the great emancipator? And how does this film suggest about his leadership style and use of presidential power?
Well, in the movie, Spielberg focuses on the messy political process required to achieve abolition, showing his leadership style characterized by pragmatic maneuvering and a strategic but sometimes ruthless use of his presidential power. To go along with the narrative, Lincoln is depicted as the indispensable man with a moral conviction to pass the 13th Amendment. He's depicted as focusing on the greater good while carrying an immense burden and having the power of rhetoric. It challenges his image because of political corruption, Lincoln authorizing bribes and lies, his role in Congress, and the timing of the amendment. So those were my thoughts for the third question.
I think it's also cool to note that, well, not cool, but the 13th Amendment was abolishing slavery, but with the 13th Amendment, it didn't immediately just be oh, slavery gone. It was more of a gradual process, and with the Emancipation Proclamation, which obviously came before the 13th Amendment, not all slaves were freed on January 1st. And so I think it's important, and this might be another question, but with the 13th Amendment, yes, it abolished slavery, but did it truly abolish slavery? Because there was still a lot of racism. So what do y'all think about that?
I also think Spielberg's portrayal of him, it also shows not only his political life, but also showed his at-home life too, and how it affected his marriage with Mary Todd, and his relationships with his children and all, and it showed that it was a difficult time to go through, and but he kind of stuck with morality even though it was difficult, and even though there were a lot of people who opposed him, it's still his portrayal, Spielberg's portrayal of Lincoln showed not only the political side, but also the side that had to do with morality and how it really affected an entire nation based off of one person, essentially.
Yeah, I agree with that because it really showed who Lincoln was as a person and why he made the decisions that he did regarding slavery and the 13th Amendment.
And I think it's also interesting to note, I kind of forgot where I was going with this, but with the 13th Amendment, obviously it was not a unanimous decision. Obviously there was a lot of people opposed to the 13th Amendment because obviously half of our country believed that slavery was a good institution and it brought in a lot of profit for the South, and
It was enough for him to get assassinated over. So
Exactly,
it was a big issue.
Yeah. And it just kind of shows yes, with the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, I think this movie really shows the struggle with it, because there was a lot of moral aspect to it. Obviously, I know my personal opinion, slavery is not okay, and I think Lincoln also agreed with that. And I think the moral aspect of how slavery is, not a good institution and how it shouldn't be practiced, but also had political and reasonable backings behind that as well. And so I think that's why a lot more people went on board with the 13th Amendment, because it they didn't agree with the moral aspect of where he's coming from, but they more sided with the political and how they achieved it.
It was I was just going to say it was also difficult because it brought in a very large divide in Congress and in the actual political institutions who are handling this, because obviously not all the time, not everybody's going to agree, but this is an issue that caused a civil war and obviously divided Congress very much. And then just having executive power added on to that, and just who people believe should be in executive power, how far that power reaches, and obviously their own personal bias. It brought in a lot of ties to Congress, and you can see, like, I remember in the movie during the scene where like the actual amendment got passed, like there were people who were cheering and obviously very happy, but there were also people who were very upset about it, and like that was like the highest political institution you could be in, and there were people who felt very opposing ways the whole time.
Talking about like divisions within Congress and then obviously within the United States that led to the Civil War, how does this film illustrate the divisions within the Union itself, particularly between radical Republicans, moderate Republicans, and Democrats, over how and when to abolish slavery?
I personally believe that the film illustrates the divisions within the Union itself through the radical Republicans, because they believe that the abolition of slavery as a moral imperative that just must happen before the end of the war to ensure it will be effective. The modern Republicans were abolitionists, but were pragmatic about how to abolish slavery, which means they wanted to take things slower. The Democrats were blocking the amendment because they were pro-slavery, and their votes were harder to win. And because of this, it shows how each party, their thoughts on slavery and how it divided the Union over the topic of slavery.
And I think it's also like interesting to note how going into this class, I always just thought Union was against slavery and Confederacy was for slavery, but it's cool to see, like with the Republicans who were a part of the Union Party, there was also like different sections of the Republicans and how they viewed, slavery. Obviously they viewed it as it should be abolished, but also like what everyone said, like the radical Republicans, they just wanted it out. They complete abolition of slavery and just did it before the end of the war. But with the moderate Republicans, they viewed it more as like, oh yes, this should be done, but we should take it more at a like responsible way and like make sure everything's taken care of, and there won't be any more conflict after this. And so it's interesting to see, and it's definitely like shown throughout the movie that while the war was between Union and Confederacy, it was also like there's a lot of different opinions and political views like flowing around and throughout Congress and throughout the United States. And so it's interesting to see that and like see that portrayed throughout the movie and also like obviously throughout history.
Yeah, to me that just kind of makes me think of what she was saying, like kind of what has been talked about in AP Gov, like the difference between like liberal and Democrat, or like Republican and conservative. Like it's not all just like one like brick wall and stuff. And so like she was saying, there was a lot of emotion that went into it. Like it was a difficult thing because it was a very real issue, and it was one that affected our entire nation, and like it was just so large and so widespread that coming to a decision over it, like obviously it's very difficult to come to decisions about this stuff, but like as well the urgency that it had to try and get it done before the war ended was also just really important. You're smiling at me. But yes, just the urgency and the emotion that went into it was just a huge part of it.
I agree with that. I do think emotion had a lot to do with everyone's votes on the topic. The movie did a good job at showing the emotion that everyone felt. I remember in the movie, while they were voting for or against the 13th Amendment, someone who said yes to the amendment said, like, shoot me down but I'm saying yes, and that shows how passionate the people were about the topic and how a lot of their decisions had to do with emotion.
Right. And I think that's also, like, in the movie there's also a scene where, like, Abraham Lincoln is talking about it and he's saying, like, now, and he just really wanted it to, obviously the 13th Amendment being passed. And then, I have another question, but kind of going along with question one, and and we're talking about like the emotions and morality of it, and then political pragmatism. In what ways does the film highlight the tension between moral conviction and political pragmatism in achieving abolition?
I mean, I think it just goes back to the issue of just Congress being divided, because, you know, that's supposed to be a place where, you know, issues get solved, people come together, you vote, you agree, you know. The idea of it is that everything all works out, but obviously that's not all that happens. Like, there was arguing, there were people who were upset, people who were happy, people who just couldn't believe the outcome, and like that emotion just really carried into it. And it showed that there are ties to these things, because like people's opinions are like one of the most important and things they have about them. And so like when those like when it comes to a nation and it comes to a big issue that goes across the nation, it gets a little bit more than just your personal feelings, and it shows through in different ways for different people.
I definitely agree with that.
I like, obviously, like I feel like as we wrap up this discussion, obviously slavery does not exist legally in the United States anymore. However, like, you know, the conversation between moral conviction and political pragmatism still happens today. We still have a lot of like issues and debates over, well, is this moral or is this like right constitutionally? And I think it's really interesting to note that like even, you know, back in when the 13th Amendment was being passed and during the 1800s, I think, you know, Lincoln was obviously struggling, and it was seen throughout the movie with more moral conviction and political pragmatism. But it's also interesting to note how this still affects us today as, you know, future voters, but also as, you know, our political state of the world currently. So I think it's interesting to know.
And I also just think it's interesting, also going off of APGov, even though this is a push, like it's affected so many decisions, like the court case, Brown v. the Board of Education, just like going off of that and seeing how that was in 1954, I think, and so it was pretty recent. It was a whole issue on education, on how like black people were allowed into the education system, and it was like a pretty recent thing. And like it's just interesting to see how, like, even though technically segregation is abolished, it is still prominent, and I think it's an issue that like really needs to be focused on.
I agree.
Cool guys, that was the end of our discussion.
I hope you liked it.
Yes. Thank you for listening.
Bye.